Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson, and this is the first of a series of lectures on Homer's landmark epic, the Odyssey. In the course of the lectures, we will have discussed all of the major events in the epic, as well as most of its major themes. As I've indicated here in the title, I think the major theme that we want to think about when we read the Odyssey is the nature of time and how it relates to the human experience. And I think Homer is a master at bringing that forth throughout the epic. In this lecture, we'll cover this first background section. We're going to look at the epic homecomings of the Greek heroes after the events depicted in the Iliad. So the war with Troy, the Trojan War, the events portrayed in other epics at the same time, written at the same time as Homer's epics, and how Homer's Odyssey is building on those, expanding on those. We'll also want to highlight this distinction between narrative and story time. So the distinction between how things are told in the epic and how the events unfold in reality, so to speak. And we'll have a chance to have a preliminary reflection on Odysseus as a character and his identity. So before we begin, it's just, I think, a good point of departure to remind ourselves what happens in the work as a whole. So the Odyssey, like the Iliad, consists of 24 books, so 24 sections. And these sections, you'll recall, are the amount of material that can be written approximately on one papyrus scroll, and that conveniently became at the time a book. In the first four of the 24 books, we have events that are happening back on Ithaca. We're not presented with Odysseus, the main character, for the first four books, so a good section of the epic. First four books deal with his home that he's trying to get to, and we find out that it's in dire straits indeed. We see the problems faced by Odysseus's wife, Penelope, and his son, Telemachus. In a way, it's about Telemachus and the challenges he has to face in order to become a man, so to speak, and assert himself in the absence of his father. And he's helped in that way by Athena. And because it focuses on Telemachus, it's sometimes called the Telemachy. In book 5, we first meet Odysseus. It's near the end of his travels. He's been traveling for 10 years since the fall of Troy, trying to get home, but has been blocked in a number of ways. We find him on the Isle of Calypso, a powerful sorceress or nymph that is, in a way, it's an ideal setting in that she offers him immortality, living with her, a beautiful goddess for the rest of time. He denies that, and we find out he's been there for 7 years already, and all he longs for is to see the fires of his home. He's released from that island and is then marooned on another island, the island of the Phaeacians, and he from book 6 to 8, his meeting of the Phaeacians and ingratiating himself with them is depicted. Books 9 to 12 have Odysseus recount his journeys to that point, to the Phaeacians. So this is the section, probably the most famous section. When people think of the Odyssey, they think of the many journeys that Odysseus had, and it's in this section that Odysseus is recounting to the Phaeacians these many adventures with the Cyclops, with Scylla and Charybdis, etc. Finally, the last half of the Odyssey depicts Odysseus arriving home on Ithaca. Here again, the danger is still present. There are over 100 suitors who are armed and with violent attentions on his life, on his son's life, and he meets mortal danger, no less a danger than he faced with the Cyclops, etc. But now it's about regaining his identity and his position in the human world, as opposed to, let's say, the world of monsters and gods and goddesses. So let's talk about the background of these types of epic homecomings. With the Iliad, Homer's great epic of the Trojan War and the wrath of Achilles, we have a certain type of epic, let's say maybe a war epic. And we have a slightly different type of epic in the Odyssey. Now, these are not the only two epics that the Greeks had developed in response to their kind of legends and stories around the Trojan War. In fact, there's an entire epic cycle listed on the right. You can see the names of the works on the right and what was depicted in those works. We only have extant, so remaining to us in the present, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The rest we know from fragments of other authors referring to what happened in those other epics, but they've been lost to us. From what we understand, it's not, it is a great loss, but it's not as disastrous as a loss as it may seem, because even in the time of the ancient Greeks, it was already recognized that the works of Homer were far and away the greatest of these epics. But you can see the epic cycle begins with a work called the Cypria that dealt with the judgment of Paris and how that ultimately led to the Trojan War, how Paris picked Aphrodite in this judgment. Aphrodite had promised Paris the most beautiful woman in the world, which was Helen of Sparta. He wins Helen of Sparta, steals her potentially from Menelaus, a Greek king, takes her back to Troy. And that begins, of course, that is the events that launched 1,000 ships, launched the great Greek contingent that sailed to Troy to win her back. The Iliad depicts a small portion of that war, the Achilles' rage, and you can see other lectures on this channel on that work. And if you haven't read it, I obviously highly recommend it. And there are several other works that deal with other events at the tail end of the war, the end of the war, that we'll have to take note of, because these events end up having repercussions that are shown in the Odyssey and lead to the types of struggles that prevent Odysseus and some of his other colleagues from getting home. For instance, in the Aethiopsis, a book of 5 books. So remember, Iliad and the Odyssey have 24 books, so it's an expansive scale. It's dealing with great events to great depth. This is a smaller work. It described events immediately after the funeral of Hector and depicted Achilles' death. Then the Little Iliad depicted the after effects of Achilles' death and the sack Troy. So after Achilles' death, Ajax the Greater killed himself because the Greeks voted to award Achilles' armor to Odysseus, not to Ajax the Greater. So Ajax the Greater was always depicted in the Iliad as the second greatest warrior in terms of martial valor and let's say strength and skill with the spear and sword, so to speak. Odysseus is the crafty planner, and the Greeks symbolically chose to give the award to value as true heroism and as a true leadership the type of virtue that Odysseus brought to the table, as opposed to the martial brute strength that Ajax the Greater brought to the table. And this work also depicts the famous building of the Trojan horse. We'll get a bit more of that in the Odyssey. A description of this a little later on. However, the greatest depiction of the Trojan horse and the aftermath that we have in extant literature is actually is a product of Roman literature much later, Virgil's Aeneid. And again, I have lectures on the literature channel on that if you want to check out that work. The other work that is very important for us is the Ilioupersis, the Sack of Ilium. So it's two books and overlaps somewhat with the Iliad in terms of showing the fall of Troy. But this work really concentrates on the sacrilegious acts of the Greeks in the sack of Troy. Okay, so the Greeks, when they sacked Troy, according to this work, committed outrages that turned the gods and goddesses against them, and thus meant that their return home to Greece, to their homes in Greece, were in some cases forestalled and delayed for years. In some cases, it meant that when they got home, in the case of Agamemnon, they got home right away, but they were murdered at their doorstep. And obviously, this is also the case with Odysseus, for slightly different reasons, but it parallels his delay in returning home is paralleled by these other heroes and is referred to often in the Odyssey. So some of the sacrileges, and Achilles' son Neoptolemus kills Priam at his household altar. So Priam, this elderly man, is seeking shelter at an altar, supposedly a preserve of the divine, and would normally have shelter there. Neoptolemus disregards that, grabs him by the hair, and stabs him, according to Virgil's depiction of this in the Aeneid, to the hilt of his sword. Similarly, Neoptolemus grabs the baby, the infant Astyanax, who we see in the Iliad, this young infant of Hector and Andromache, and Neoptolemus grabs him, throws him over the walls of Troy, and to be dashed to his death at the rocks below. Finally, the lesser Ajax, so there's Ajax the Greater, who killed himself in disgrace for not winning the armor of Achilles, and there's the lesser Ajax, who commits maybe the greatest sacrilege of all in raping Cassandra, Priam's daughter, in the temple of the goddess Athena. So this, of course, another major sacrilege in a number of ways. She's seeking shelter in a temple, a divine sanctuary, and he disregards that. He rapes her. It's also the temple of a virgin goddess, and so in a number of ways, these actions anger the gods and goddesses, and in this case, Athena in particular. So the other elements there of the epic cycle is this work depicting returns of Greek warriors. And as I mentioned, these returns are impacted by the fact that they committed these sacrilegious acts. So the Nostoi, or returns, so Nostos is home or returning home. This work told of these Greek warriors' voyages home. Agamemnon, as I quickly mentioned, his return home meant that he was killed by his wife and her lover Aegisthus. Menelaus and Helen, who we'll see in book 4 of the Odyssey, were driven off course, and they spent years in Egypt and finally only got home on their 8th year after the sack of Troy. Ajax the Lesser, the one who committed that sacrilegious rape of Cassandra, was killed at sea. And Odysseus, although not directly committing an act in the sacrilegious act in the sack of Troy, is not helped by his patron goddess is Athena, and she seems to look out for him. In the first 10 years of his voyaging, we don't see Athena really step in and help him, but it's in the 10th year that we see at the beginning of the Odyssey Athena appeal to Zeus to grant that Odysseus be allowed to return home. So Nostos means homecoming or return, and this is the obvious theme of the Odyssey. In the same way that kleos or glory is the theme of the Iliad, what drives Achilles is a desire for glory. Now, glory is still to some extent a concern for Odysseus, but the return home, it seems to me, is a more driving concern. Some people want to divide epic into a kleos epic versus a nostos epic. But as I said, I think another distinction might be war epic and versus peace epic. In terms of the theme that I've already mentioned, time and the human experience in the Odyssey. So let's always keep that in mind about how this work is in a lot of ways about the temporal experience of humans and how we're tied to time. The theme of Nostos fits in with that really well. Anytime we're journeying home, I think there's an anticipation of the future. I know myself when I was heading home after being away for a long time, there's that anticipation of, well, I can't wait to get home. I can't wait to see my loved ones there. And, I know they've missed me, I've missed them, and there's going to be, warm embrace. They're going to be happy to see me. I'm going to be happy to see them. There's that anticipation of the future return. There's also the memory of past joys. That's what brings one there. The anticipation is probably structured by memories of similar moments of joyful reunions in the past. There's also the moment of the present and the regret of lost time in the moment, the regret of not being there. So time in a homecoming is really this unity of the three dimensions of time working in that kind of directedness to the home. So I want to mention too at the outset how at the beginning of the work, the beginning of the Odyssey, it's called the proem, the bard, the poet, runs through a brief resume of Odysseus's adventures after the fall of Troy. He's not named at first. He's not named until line 21, but he's identified at the very first line by the epithet in Greek, polytropos. So one of many terms. So poly, we get that prefix carried over into English, meaning many, poly, and tropos, turnings. So he's a way of translating it might be the man of many turns or many turnings. So in some ways, right in the first line, we have kind of a defining feature of Odysseus. So in what way is he polytropos? In what way is Odysseus a man of many turns? So I guess, literally in terms of his story, his wanderings throughout the Mediterranean Sea, trying to find his way back to Ithaca, he's literally a man of many turns, given his wanderings back and forth across the Mediterranean, as I said. But it's also descriptive of his character. He's a man of many clever plans. He can be deceptive. So he's a man of many twists and turns. You can't necessarily pin him down. Maybe he's lying. He's also, as I said, has these elaborate, skilled plans. He's the one who comes up with the ingenious idea of the Trojan horse in the first place. And he's a man skilled with words and rhetorical speeches. So in all of these senses, he has many rhetorical turns and twists. So a trope is a rhetorical term for turn of phrase, where a phrase is maybe bringing together two images or concepts that might not have been brought together before. So it'll be, we know from the first lines that this will be an epic about wanderings, about many turns, a man of many turns and wanderings in homecoming. And whereas the Iliad, right from the first line, the first line was the rage of Achilles, sing goddess. The Iliad was about a man of rage and martial valor. So there's two different, say, heroic types at play here, two sets of thematics at play, two ways in which humans can be engaged in striving. So a little bit more about Odysseus. Even in the Iliad, so the Iliad is obviously Achilles is the main character and the hero, so to speak, of the Iliad, but there are allusions to the central role of Odysseus in terms of heroism and leadership of the Greeks. So in book 2 of the Iliad, there's a catalog of Greek ships. So there's, and the catalog is divided into the 29 contingents or groups of people that came from, say, 29 tribes or localities of the Greeks. And each contingent is led by the king of that tribe. So in that catalog of ships, Agamemnon's Mycenaean contingent is listed 9th from the beginning. Achilles' Myrmidon contingent is 21st or 9th from the end. So there's a symmetry there, and an apt symmetry because the events of the Iliad are really structured around this battle between Agamemnon and Achilles to some extent. That's what's the motor of the plot at the beginning before Achilles turns his rage to Hector. And then Odysseus's Ithacan contingent is the central position. So of 29, 15 is the center. It's the central position of that list, but it also means that his ships occupied the central position of the lines of ships along the beaches at Troy. So it's in front of Odysseus's ships that the assemblies would most likely take place when they said they got together at the center of the ships. So we have let's say, a subtle allusion at that point in book 2 of the Iliad already of Odysseus's central position and position of leadership among the Greeks. So I mentioned one thing I'd like to highlight is, again, in connection with the theme of time, is the innovative way in which this epic plays with narrative time and narrative order in relationship to story time. So first, I want to make that distinction clear. So a narrative time, or the order of a narrative, is how a story is told. So sometimes we tell a story, we begin in the middle, we flash back to events that happened earlier. So the narrative order is the order of things as they are told. They might not be in chronological order of how the events supposedly happened in time. Whereas, pardon me, story time is the order of events as they happened. Okay, so we begin in the epic with Ithaca in the present, so to speak. We begin with Ithaca after Odysseus has already been wandering for 10 years. So the first 4 books are about that moment, at the tail end, really, of all the events of Odysseus's wandering. In terms of story time, the events that happened 10 years earlier are actually what happens first, right? So if we turn to this diagram where I've tried to depict these things, the narrative order is at the top. how we are told things in the epic. So the narrator tells us things, tells us about Ithaca, which is happening, as I said, at the end of all of his wanderings. He tells us of the Isle of Calypso, the Isle of the Phaeacians. He tells us of Odysseus recounting his story. And then he tells us of the events back on Ithaca. The events as they happened in chronological order would begin with, well, the Trojan War that happens kind of in the background before all these things. Odysseus's wanderings for 3 years, where he encounters these different adventures, and then he ends up spending 7 years on the Isle of Calypso, and we know all this because it's recounted in books 9 and 12. Then he lands on the Isle of the Phaeacians. Then he gets to Ithaca. So if we were to describe the events as they happened chronologically, the bottom order would be the way in which the narrator should have depicted the events. But narrators, especially beginning with Homer, adjust these, let's say, these sequences for meaningful effect within the narration. So the first effect is to delay Odysseus's entrance in the epic for 4 full books, and this has the effect of demonstrate. Well, one of the effects, I think, is to demonstrate the urgency of the situation back on Ithaca. So we see in the first 4 books how the suitors are pressing, how Penelope is at her wit's end, and she needs to come to a decision of what she's going to do. Telemachus is at his wit's end. The suitors are planning to kill him. It's a real crisis for Odysseus's family. Odysseus's wife Penelope is left not knowing what to do. We don't have. We're talking about a time where she couldn't, let's say, divorce Odysseus in absentia if he didn't arrive home after several years. She has to assume he's either alive or dead. If he's alive, her absolute duty is to protect the home, protect Telemachus, and ensure that everything is in good order when he returns. If she's a widow, her absolute duty is to get married again and turn over the home to Telemachus. It's a patriarchal society. The home, the belongings would be passed down to the rightful male heir. She would go on, attach herself to another husband, and begin again, so to speak. So she has 2 conflicting duties there, and her delaying tactic that we'll talk about is a way of trying to play off both of those tensions. Again, similarly, Telemachus is left not knowing whether he should guard the kingdom for his father or assert his own right to be king, in assuming that his father is dead. They're left in this limbo, and both of their courses of action are unclear. The society itself, so it's the problem with the family, but the society itself seems to be crumbling. It's a power vacuum. It's a society that's questioningly monarchical. Their monarch has been gone for 20 years. So Odysseus was gone for 10 years, the course of the Trojan War, and now he's been wandering for another 10 years. So the Odyssey takes for granted that a country must have a king. Ithaca has been without its king for 20 years. The suitors are a real menace, and in a way are a product of a society without leadership and without fathers. When Odysseus left to go to the Trojan War 20 years ago, he took a good portion of the young men with him from Ithaca. So all the men of fighting age went with him, leaving many of these younger men who are now grown up and want to start lives of their own without both a leader as a king, but also without a father. So Homer starts the Odyssey at this precise moment where the situation in Ithaca is kind of at a climax. They, his family, his society needs Odysseus home. They need him home now. Um, Penelope had, as I mentioned, had a delaying tactic of um, for that held off the suitors for a few years, where she would say that her last duty as wife to Odysseus would be fulfilled if she were to weave a shroud, a burial shroud for Odysseus's father, Laertes, and that when she had completed that, she could move on and marry one of the suitors. She would, in a famous trick, she would weave during the day, and then, in order to forestall that moment, would undo the weaving that she had done at night. But this trick has been found out. We find out later in the epic, and this delaying will no longer work. They need Odysseus back now. So I'll end my reflections here, this opening background lecture, by talking about, let's say, the bookends of the epic. So we've talked a bit about kind of the opening of the epic. The opening of the epic, in book one, we see a description of Odysseus's identity as Palutropos. Then we go on to see the depiction of Telemachus. Athena arrives in disguise as Mentor, and we get the name Mentor later on based on the role that Athena in disguise plays here in the Odyssey of guiding this young gentleman. So Athena arrives in order to help Telemachus become more active and attain his true identity. He's been passive. He's been kind of waiting, and he needs to, let's say, assert himself. And Athena comes to help him do that. He calls an assembly of the Ithacans to call out the suitors. That happens in book two. He then travels to Pylos and Sparta in order to find out news of his father Odysseus. That happens in books 3 and 4. So, in a way, his son needs to be guided to his true identity. So, too, in book 24, and we'll see this when we get there, Odysseus meets his aged father Laertes, who's in despair. Laertes, too, is he's living out in the countryside with pigs and other animals, in despair that he feels he's lost his son forever. And Odysseus needs to bring forth Laertes' true identity as well as a regal father figure. So there's this continuity through time structured by the story itself, beginning with the son. In the middle, we have Odysseus finding himself, and then coming back to Odysseus's father at the end, almost in kind of reverse order in terms of how it's depicted in son, father, grandfather, showing the continuity through time of the three generations, showing how they point to one another as, in some ways, how they can define themselves and find meaning. So I'll end the lecture there. When I come back for our next lecture, we'll look in more detail at the first 4 books, often called the Telemachy. Thank you very much.